before I continue, I want to publicly pay reverence and respect to this indigenous Yurjin Ohlone land that we're currently on right now, but often forget or don't know about because of settler colonialism, because of black dislocation, which invisibilizes, which naturalizes, which rationalizes the ongoing project of colonialism. And so that brings me to why we're here today. Welcome to the Department of Educational Leadership's Critical Speaker Series. And through this speaker series that we've been curating all year long, we've aimed to provide speakers that not only speak to topics that critically and intellectually provoke your minds, but also speak to the urgency that I know that we all have on the ground to transform these unjust and oppressive conditions that are among us. Each of our speakers this year, from Dr. Kamanyan to Dr. Robak-Sako to today's speaker, Dr. Dumas, have demonstrated a commitment and ethics to visibilize what's been invisibilized, to question the unquestionable, to politicize what's been neutralized. And as we engage with our final speaker of the school year, we hope that through our speaker series, that we've been creating the conditions culturally to not just stay woke, but to stay getting woke, to be on this ongoing project to deepen our critical analysis on the world around us and what we can do about transforming what is unacceptable. And so with that, I want to first introduce our Department of Ed Leadership Chair, Dr. Peg Winkleman, to offer a few words. Please give it up.
So my very few words are to let our speaker know who's in the room. So in this room, we have folks who are working on their preliminary administrative credential. Round of applause for those folks. We have people who are working on their masters, and we have our faculty who supervise them, so our masters folks. And we have our doctoral candidates in their first, second, and third year, and coming into the program as well. And what we all have in common, as Dr. Ray so beautifully stated, is this commitment to equity and leadership for social justice. So this has been a wonderful piece that we just added this year. Dr. Margaret Harris really shepherded the work with several other faculty members to get the grant, to have the speakers and the food and the space. And we are, we are submitting to be able to do this next year as well, we hope. Because it gives us an opportunity across all these different spaces. We also come from throughout the area, so we have these titles about what degrees we're working on. But more importantly, we all work in a context and a shared commitment, and we get to engage with our speakers and with one another about the work to serve the students all the way from preschool. We've got folks there through career. So that's what we're about, and that's what Carolyn Nelson is about as she leads the College of Education and Allied Studies. So I'd like her to come up and address.
I'm only going to take like 2 minutes to do this, but I need you to know that, is this working? Right? Oh, good. Well, anyway. Press a button. I need you to know that just coming here, in the few minutes I've already been here, I'm already inspired. And I haven't even heard the speaker yet. So, because each of you has such powerful stories in your research that you've already begun to share with me, keeps me motivated to do what I do. Even though I'm not in the classroom anymore or at schools, I actually am, because I go out and visit a lot. But I want you to know how important your stories are to share with each other. I also so value the lens around asking the critical questions, the critical theoretical questions that you need to ask. Because when you have a critical lens, critical social justice lens, it compels you to ask a different kind of question. Yesterday, I was talking to a whole group. Did you know that we were hosting an international conference here for sustainable tourism. It was hosted by a department in my college. My college was hosting it. Most of the participants were from countries outside of the United States. And I talked about what makes our college distinctive, because hospitality, recreation, and tourism is part of my college. And what that means is, what does that mean if you take a critical social justice lens on sustainable tourism? What kinds of questions do you ask with that lens that you wouldn't ask just if you just looked at tourism, sustainable tourism by itself? The distinctive feature about our college is we take a critical social justice lens at whatever we do, a cross-disciplinary lens that compels you to ask who's being served, who's being left out of the conversation, who's not at the table. And I can't wait to hear people's response to what you have to share with them tonight. So thank you, Dr. Dumas, for being here. Thank you for sharing yourself and what you've learned. And the students will be sharing part of themselves also, based on what they want to know from you. So thank you for this opportunity. And thank you to all the faculty for making this happen. Dr. Ariasa, please stand. Dr. Gray, please stand. Dr. Gies is standing. And who am I? Margaret, Dr. Harris, please stand. And we're going to applaud them because they worked so hard. Thank you, Debbie, for coordinating all this and for being so lovely out there, having a sign to direct everybody to this room. We so appreciate it, and making all the contacts. So it takes a, to use another word for it, it takes a village to make these things happen. But this is a beautiful night, and I know you'll feel like you've learned, and I know you'll feel like the time is the best it will. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. And so now I have the esteemed honor to introduce our brilliant speaker for this evening. Dr. Michael J. Dumas is an assistant professor at my alma mater, UC Berkeley, and he teaches in the Graduate School of Education in African American Studies. Dr. Dumas earned his PhD in urban education with emphasis in social educational policy studies from the Graduate Center at City University of New York. His research sits at the intersection of the cultural politics of Black education, the cultural political economy of urban education, and the futurity of Black childhood. He's primarily interested in how schools become violent sites of Black material as well as psychic suffering. He examines how disgust with and disdain for Blackness inform defenses of inequitable distribution of educational resources. He investigates the ways that anti-Blackness persists in educational policy discourses and in broader public discourses on the demonstrated work of economic and educational investment in Black children. And so before I bring up Dr. Dumas to ignite this space, I want to say this about this brother. Dr. Dumas is committed to pushing thought, not for the sake of pushing thought or for critique, but to inspire transformation in the ways that we especially need in our political climate today. He has a demonstrated commitment to build with others because we can't do this work by ourselves. And he also supports early career scholars like myself in navigating the academy in ways that stays true to our aims of working towards social justice. And so with that, please show some love for Dr. Michael Dumas.
You can hold this mic or whether it will this long here. I probably should just because it'll make life easier for those in the back and also for my voice. So thank you. I was going to do that same thank you to all the people who helped to make this possible. So I'm looking at some of you that I've already met. And thank you for everything. Thank you for everything. And especially Margaret coordinating all the little details of getting me here today. There's so much I wanted to say, almost somewhat basic on your introduction. I mean, this notion of being woke, I'm thinking of Christina Sharp's book, In the Wake, on Blackness and Being, where she talks about the wake as being three different things. One is that kind of notion of being awake or consciousness. The other is the wake of the slave ship, the wake that the water leaves. And so those kinds of memories and histories and the kind of afterlife of slavery in that way. And then she talks about the awake in the sense of a memorialization of the dead, remembering the dead. sitting with their memories and committing to action based on that, right? So you sit there at a wake and you think about who have these people been for us, and what do they want us to do now and be in the world. So in some ways, that's a way of expanding even the notion of wokeness, when we think about the wake, that encompasses all three of those things. And that will be implicit in some of the things I say today. So I'm beginning here with Montrevious Thomas. This is Montrevious Thomas. And I want to talk about him and what they put him through. Montrevious was 13, this is a couple of years ago now, so let's think about this as I tell the story and then think about where he may be today. He was a student in a public school in Muskogee County, Georgia. And just a couple of years ago, he had some trouble with a student in his home school, and the district sent him as a punishment to spend 4 days at Edgewood Student Services Center, an alternative school for children with behavioral difficulties. And this is the first time that Montrevious had actually ever been in trouble, and he did not have a history of violent outbursts or altercations. On his first day at Edgewood, Montrevious tried to leave the classroom to call his mother. Somehow a school behavioral specialist intervened. And I will say this about the school behavioral specialist. It sounds like they actually have formal credentials, but it's really somebody with a BA that they call a school behavioral specialist. They put in these positions without really that much training. You know what this, I'm familiar with this. And so ultimately this person came in, basically the larger black male, and he ultimately body slammed Montrevious to the ground 3 times to prevent him from leaving the room. Montrevious complained that his leg felt numb and that he couldn't walk. School officials thought he was just faking it. So the same behavioral specialist basically, who just assaulted the 13-year-old, throws the boy over his shoulder and takes him to the school bus, and Montrevious is taken home. But Montrevious was not faking it. His mother took him to the emergency room later that night, and he was airlifted to an Atlanta hospital. The internal injuries he sustained in the assault by the school official at Edgewood were severe. Doctors attempted several emergency surgeries to get blood flowing back to his limb, and when these efforts failed, they told Montrevious and his mother that the only choice left was to amputate his leg, his right leg. I published an article in 2014 called Losing an Arm. In that piece, I began with a painfully similar story from the work of the acclaimed science fiction writer Octavia Butler. In Butler's 1979 novel Kindred, and this is from the new graphic novel, which just came out recently, her 1979 novel, Dana Franklin finds herself transported from her home in present-day Los Angeles to antebellum Maryland, where she must endure the horrors of slavery while ensuring the later existence of, by protecting Rufus Whalen, who is one of her accident-prone and abusive white ancestors. And he summons her back in time whenever his life is in danger somehow. Butler begins Dana's story at the end. The first line of the novel is, "I lost an arm on my last trip home, my left arm." Dana's arm, we later learned, has been taken back into history, for lack of a better way of saying it, by Rufus, who had been holding her down and attempting to assault her as she was returned to the present. I was at a book reading actually here in Oakland years ago, and Octavia Butler was asked, why did Dana have to lose her arm? And Octavia Butler, if you're familiar at all with her, and her kind of the quietness of her voice, but also very deepness and very matter-of-fact tone, she said, because there's no one who could experience that and not have lost something. And that's what she said. And we all just sat there. So, like Dana, Montrevious' limb, his right leg, had been taken into history. That is to say, like Dana, he was beaten like a slave, his flesh not his own, even now, his suffering condoned and even facilitated by the state and its agents. Yes, now, so many years now, after our bondage in this land is imagined to have ended. So my talk today is called Against the Dark, recognizing and responding to anti-blackness in education. At the center of my remarks is a theoretical engagement with anti-blackness, which is the central concern within a broader range of critical black studies, and then more specifically within an intellectual project in black studies known as Afro-pessimism. But a lot of people who I don't want to say too much about this because I don't want you to get too lost in the woods with the theory, but I want you to know a little bit. And what I mean to say by this, I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time explaining the body of work and how it takes up the black condition and the possibility of black freedom in what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. Then, of course, I want to suggest that schooling and our very imagination of education are sites of anti-Blackness, sites of Black suffering, as I have written. And I want to offer a number of examples. Finally, in terms of responding to anti-Blackness, I want to be clear that there is no Black freedom to be found in schools, which are inherently and deeply anti-Black. But I do believe that schools can be spaces of Black fugitivity, which is always subversion, a refusal of the desires of the master. So this is meant to be interactive, which means that as I go through this, you're welcome, and I'll actually offer opportunities to just interact at different times. And so especially when there's kind of a densely theoretical text up on there, I'll probably pause and actually just kind of talk about it amongst ourselves, and then we'll kind of come back to the talk, so it's not just me droning on and on. And sometimes you can get lost in these intellectual, scholarly texts that don't make the application. So we'll pause to do some of that throughout. So I'm going to begin with a brief explanation of anti-Blackness. And I'm going to acknowledge here that there's some tension within Black studies with regard to Afro-pessimism as an intellectual project. I want to be clear that not every scholar that I cite here would identify as an Afro-pessimist. That's really not, are you not? But I would say that their work has been central in the analysis of anti-Blackness. And finally, part of the problem is that given Afro-pessimism's refusal to engage questions of policy reform or the possibility of Black uplift or incremental progress within the world as we know it, it also presents a challenge for an applied field like education, which is one of the major education. Which is compelled to say and do things in service of schooling. That's kind of why we said we're going to, we believe schools can do these things, and you have a field that says, actually no, the whole society is setting against Black people, so there's nothing really good we're really going to do ultimately for Black freedom in any kind of way. And here we are. And so there's a challenge. So schooling is one of the major functions of the U.S. nation state, and itself the site of so much Black suffering. And again, a U.S. nation state that is set against Black life, or in other words, is deeply interested in Black death, which we'll talk about. Even so, I believe Afro-pessimism goes further than most scholarly and public discourses on race and racial inequality in explaining the specific conditions of Black life and death, and in offering us a way to imagine an elsewhere, some other time and place where we might find Black freedom. And we'll come back to that, because that's the kind of end part. We're like, well, what do we do now? That's probably what's already on your mind. What do we do now? And I want you to kind of suspend that one for a second, because a lot of times we're focused on, well, enough talking about the problem. We already understand the problem. Actually, we don't. We don't understand the problem. And part of what the specific theorizing of anti-Blackness does is it moves us within and beyond kind of some kind of vague or general discussions of race or multiculturalism or equity or understanding, but think specifically about the specific condition and position of Blackness and Black bodies in the United States. So anti-Blackness in the US, Canada, Brazil, and other places is, in my view, best understood in relation to the terrorism of settler colonialism. We are on indigenous land. Here in the East Bay, as in so many places, that land was taken by force. Actually, it's not was taken, but is being taken by force. Either through violence, threat of violence, or deception, and in so many cases, a combination of all three. In other words, an ongoing combination of all three. So this is where and when we are on stolen land, complicit in a continuing structure of native genocide and erasure. This settler colonial project that is the United States has been founded and dependent on violence against indigenous peoples and also on a system of chattel slavery, in which the Black became synonymous with and the embodiment of the slave. That is, property accumulated and traded by whites in such a way as to expand the territory and maximize profit and advantage for the settlers and the settler state. So in this way, although there are many people who might have been enslaved, you couldn't just look at their body and say, oh, slave, because often they were released after so many years, and when a new body of that color was born, it didn't necessarily say slave. The Black body was the one that became synonymous with slave from just natally, like born up slave. And so it became synonymous in that way, unlike any other group that had been enslaved. So who we are as a nation and as a society, how we collectively understand what it means to be human here in this land, is deeply invested in dispossessing Native people of land, and dispossessing Black people of their own bodies, their own freedom. Just as settler colonialism is, as Patrick Wolf reminds us, an ongoing perpetuation of violence and not a singular event, so too the project of Black emancipation, the abolition of slavery, is also not yet, not hyphen yet. not yet finished, a struggle not yet won, a humanity not yet recognized or possible. The Black is still yet slave in the national and global ontological imagination, is how we imagine, and is subject to everyday material inflictions of anti-Black physical and psychic pain, all to satisfy the needs and desires of white settler futurity, white accumulation, white supremacy. When Saidiya Hartman insists we are living in the afterlife of slavery, this is what she means. Black lives are still in peril and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery. Skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. I too, she says, am the afterlife of slavery. So this is an important definition for, not just a metaphor, but actually since it's felt in actual flesh, it becomes more than a metaphor, right? So this too is where and when we are, in possession of and with our feet on the necks of stolen bodies, complicit in a continuing structure of Black subjugation and seemingly endless death. I want to pause it because there's a certain percentage of us who, in some ways, and I'll probably say something about this a little later, let's just say it's 20%. Let's say that there's 20% of us who become, we make six figures, or we're administrators and educators, we get to live in different neighborhoods. And so in some sense, it looks like this can't be true. But for the vast majority, I'm going to say about 80% of Black folks, and even those of us who are here, it's our kin who didn't make it quite. We know people who are that close to death, that close to being subjugated. So whatever it looks like in this room is not the reality for most Black folks. And so this is what we're talking about. No matter what you may see, and actually part of what society does, part of Story Melvin talks about the U.S. becoming officially anti-racist, which I may talk about a little later, is part of is that we create a multicultural kind of class that then looks like we've achieved something when the vast majority of our people have no access to any of this at all. And so this is not, you're not doing anything. We're not doing anything by having a few of us in this room, not for the vast majority. So I'm only interested in things, if it doesn't work for the largest 80%, and I'm making, whatever that is, it might be 85, it might be 79, whatever it is. If it does not work for the vast majority of Black folks in terms of freedom, it's not a solution. It's not freedom. It doesn't, you can't do it for the 20%, 15% of us here and call that anything. So anti-Blackness denotes the denial of Black subjectivity, the social disregard for and disgust with the Black body. At the center of this theorization is the proposition that the Black cannot be human, and in fact exists in antagonistic ontological relationship with the social world. So the social world, so this relationship becomes forged through slavery, in which the Black as slave is positioned as without human form, agency, or capacity, but is instead the fungible, exchangeable property of whites, existing not only for forced labor, so it wasn't just a labor relation, they were just like low-paid workers, I think as one of the recent history textbooks tried to put it, right? But they're also for pleasure, right? For dance, for me, have sex, or actually violence, sexual violence, whatever it is I want you for. Or just let me just accumulate you and feel good about how much I own, right? You know, when you get things you own, you kind of look at your car, you look at things, you just kind of look at them. And that just kind of fills you with whatever kind of feeling. Look at these clothes I bought. And similarly, that's what the Black was for. It's for just kind of, for not just labor, but also just for show, even. There's a way of proving one had things, one accumulated things. One feel good about oneself for having one or two or more. So it also then facilitated the accumulation and settlement of indigenous land, because they aren't workers. So you had to find some bodies to kind of like expand that territory to make more money off of it. So Frank Wilderson, this is another one of those highly theoretically things, which we'll pause on a second. Through chattel slavery, Frank Wilderson argues, the world gave birth and coherence to both its joys of domesticity, so domesticating the land, and to its struggles of political discontent. And with these joys and struggles, the human was born, but not before it murdered the Black, forging a symbiosis between the political ontology of humanity and the social death of Blacks. So in this sense, you have Black existing as not just second-class citizens, but actually as non-human, and not as non-human, but anti-human. The only way that whiteness could exist and be anything, and to be the epitome of humanity, or of human flesh, of worth, is by positioning Black as opposite of that, as anti-human. So in many ways, we talk about, enough of this black-white binary as if black people created it. Whiteness created the black-white binary. It is a worthy area of focus. So let's get beyond the black-white binary, which is not to say that part of what that critique is that, hey, we want to think about a wider range of racial ethnic groups and experiences. And in that case, that critique is valid. But often when people are saying get beyond the black-white binary, it's actually because they're nervous about talking about black people. And so it's always like, and often accompanying that is like, enough about black people. It's never enough about white people, right? It's like enough about, we've talked enough about black people. And within that is almost this kind of a bitterness to it, almost like there's almost like so much so that actually even as black professors sometimes go, oh, I did too much black stuff in that syllabus. I'm talking about it too much. Because that's how you can have 1 week on something and then the reviews say that all they ever talked about was, so because any little bit of blackness is seen as too much. And so in many ways that, coming back to that black-white binary, whiteness creates the black-white binary, it puts blackness as its opposite. And that's why we still end up talking in these terms, and why it's still meaningful, although it's a lie. But it's still a meaningful construct, and it's not something that black people came up with. So, a little bit of theory here. The social death of the slave. What is social death? Does that mean that people running through dead? No, the social death is in the kind of sense of the social world, the kind of beings that are seen as part of our social media, the civil society, that blacks are positioned outside of that, is seen as the social world can go on, and you don't really need black people. I mean, if you think, those of you who are in the CRT, if you've read, did you read the Space Traders story by Derek Bell? It's an allegory he has where basically aliens come from outer space and they offer to take all the black people away in exchange for riches and cure of all the environmental problems. They don't say what they're going to do with them, but the U.S. government basically, this is Derek Bell's story, right? And so the U.S. government has to consider this, and they put it to a vote with all people, like they just want to take all the black people away. And they've proven that they can actually provide all these solutions. And ultimately, people wrestle with it, and the vote is taken, and people say, yeah, get rid of the black people. And so on one day, they're all kind of lined up, and there's these spaceships, and off the black people go. So the story actually, which was actually made into a little short, half-hour movie back in the 80s, find it on YouTube. It's pretty in-depth in terms of as people wrestle with that, this kind of sense of like, do we need black people? So if you position black people as outside of the social world, the world can go on without black people, and that's kind of almost part of the fantasy. Because again, black people were never meant to be people, they're property. So what is the idea of being a person is kind of, we can't imagine it because, and I say this because if in 1865 all of a sudden, you have the end of slavery, boom, right? But that doesn't change the way people imagine that black people were imagined as property, as things to be owned. So if it didn't change in 1865, when did it change? If we're going to say that something in that relation changed, right? It's not to say that the conditions are exactly the same, but the relations of power, the sense of how black is imagined, when did that change? I mean, so I'm looking at what's happening with Travis Thomas, and I'm looking at what happened to Trayvon Martin, and I'm looking at what happened to Rekia Boyd, and I'm looking at all these things and I'm trying to make sense of, or I'm looking at just how my friend who teaches in the South Bronx and schools that serve black and Latino students have rats decaying in the walls, and the students smell them for several days while they're decaying, and that's fine. We allow that as a society. That's fine with us, by and large. And I'm wondering, why is that true? Well, and I'm thinking, wow, this theorization helps me make sense of it because, well, yes, it's not just lower second-class citizen or discrimination or bias, but actually if you position them as object, as property, as having no human agency or form or relation, then it makes sense to continue thinking about this afterlife of slavery. You can already see why it's what we call natural pessimism. I want you to sit with it for a second. There's things to do in it, but this is not the gleeful, happy narrative of roots or something like that. So Orlando Patterson talks about slavery involved a parasitic relationship between slave owner and slave, such that the freedom of the slave owner is only secured and understood in relation to power over the slave. For Patterson, slavery is the permanent, violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. Although although slavery involves personal relationships between groups, it also operates as an institutionalized system, maintained through social processes which make it impossible for the slave to live, like have its own life. It's because again, the slave was property. It was, when you died, you gave your, you bequeathed your slaves along with your silver and your cows and everything like that. It was on the same, if you've ever seen some of those old wills, it was right there. One Negro wench, named, called Betsy, she's 39, and she might still be having a child, I don't know. So I don't know how much she's worth, and whatever, but it was like right along with your cows and your silver. So you're not regarded as alive for her or himself in the social world. Natal alienation denotes that the black is born a slave. Slavery is not contingent or a moment in one's life, it is one's life. It is the only way that the black makes sense. In this formation, white supremacy depends on, and is in fact parasitic on, violence against the slave, whose suffering is never legible, because one piece of black property is of no more or less value than another. There is no inherent human worth in a given black body. And I'm going to say this because this is something that Barack Obama said, I think after Newtown and the violence there, he said, not one more, we can't stand one more of these children of the kind who died in Newtown to die. One more death is one too many. He went to Chicago and said, well, we can't really save every child, but if we can just save one. So the contrast between, you can't really save every black child, but if you can save a couple of them, then that's fine. But when it comes to the kind of child one imagines dies in Newtown, one more, no, not one more. One more is a violence, and so it's different than even in how our black elected officials, our representatives of the U.S. nation state, regardless of what color they are, construct and imagine black life versus white life. And that's what we're talking in terms of black life being fungible. Like if you can save one black life, cool, yeah, the other ones die. But over here, any one of those lives lost is a precious and a gem and cannot be recovered. You don't need to recover one black life because you can always get another slave. So Saidiya Hartman explains, as property, the dispossessed body of the enslaved is the surrogate for the master's body, since it guarantees his disembodied universality. We'll come back in a second. It acts as a sign of his power and dominion. Thus, while the beaten and mutilated body presumably establishes the brute materiality of existence, back to this, the materiality of suffering regularly eludes recognition or cognition by virtue of the bodies being replaced by other signs of value as well as other bodies. This is all highly theoretical, but we just kind of said this. We will actually understand this a little bit more than this Saidiya Hartman's wording here. So what does this really mean? What do you take from this? Kind of asking now. And it's kind of, I said a little bit before I read the quote, and then the quote's here. So, so you have this kind of, the master's body, master has his property, and has all these black bodies, and someone can get beaten, and even beating that slave can actually be a sign of like, oh wow, the master has power. The master gets to order this beating of this property. So in some ways you can see the beaten body, but on the other hand you don't see it because it's really not its own. There's so many that are beaten and whatever. It's like there'll be others, and really it belongs to the master anyway. So what, we can save a couple of them maybe, but it's kind of like Barack Obama's thing. Not every one of those lives are precious. If you can save one or two, you need to keep some to keep working for you, but it might be useful to actually beat some every once in a while, as an example for others, or just for one's own amusement, or because it makes sense. It doesn't shock the senses. Whereas again, any one life, white life shot would be, a tragedy. So I mean, think about this and how we think about our statistics. We have all these statistics about disproportionality. And we've got, here's a certain percentage of black students are here, and then these students are here, and it's all these numbers. And if we want to reduce inequity, we can probably reduce it by 5%. But we don't think about them necessarily. Now, many of us are actually working with, we actually have names and faces in them. But by and large, in our social discussion around this, in our field as a whole, people play with numbers, and they hope those numbers go up and down a little bit. But when it comes to these numbers of these bodies, these lives, we don't think in terms of life and death of those families, of pain, of suffering, of people crying. of wanting, of yearning, of being frustrated, of your blood pressure going up, every time your child leaves out the door. That's not how we think about it. It's statistics, it's numbers. And so in that sense, as terrible in some ways as this language, this metaphor is, this is why we talk about the afterlife of slavery. So, in this sense, white entitlement to dominion over the black is facilitated by the denial of black subjectivity. The black does not have its own kind of body that belongs to itself. It doesn't have its own will or its own ability to kind of speak. It has to be policed, surveilled, controlled. So it's not in this case that the black is exploited or abused, but that the black is incapable of being exploited or abused. It doesn't happen because it's a thing that belongs to something. It doesn't have human form and imagination. If we don't imagine it as human, then we can't see it being exploited or abused. And that's true in the Obama quote, right? It's like, we're going to lose someone. Sorry. But over here, we can't lose a single one. So thus, even as the material suffering of the black is readily observed, it can just as readily be dismissed as not really possible, since the slave, as the possession of whites, cannot suffer on its own accord as a being for itself. So finally, here there's no need to protect the life of the slave except as it benefits white accumulation. The fungibility, trade exchange of the black body means that we needn't care what happens to a given black person because another black will serve the same function. Each of them don't really matter. So, anti-blackness requires the state to act to contain black bodies to serve the desires of whites and protect them from the inherent damage of proximity to black bodies. In her discussion of Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 U.S. Supreme Court ruling which determined that black people were not entitled to share the same public facilities with whites, Saidiya Hartman argues that, quote, the integrity of the white race delineated the public good. In other words, public was constructed as white, and black was imagined as the enemy, not just of white people, but against the freedom of the public to live unencumbered by blackness. Basically, Hartman explains, the wholeness of the social body was made possible by the banishment and objection of blacks, the isolation of dangerous elements from the rest of the population, and the containment of contagion. Think about every little eyes on the prize series you've ever seen, all the discussions in this kind of sense of what the presence of a black body would do to the kind of sense of disgust and disdain just by being in proximity to the black. And so this wholeness of the social body was just disrupted, impossible, with this kind of presence of these dangerous elements, this flesh, this black flesh that's right there, disrupting the possibility of the public to be free. So, scholars who theorize anti-blackness insist that although chattel slavery is no longer legal, with the huge exception of U.S. prisons, the social relation of master-slave is still constitutive of the relationship between white and black. That is to say, the black is still positioned as slave, and the relations of power remain unchanged, which is not to say that everything looks the same. It's just that the relations of power, the relations of how we imagine this to be so. And part of what I'm thinking is, if it didn't, then when did that change? When would you say that there's a marked change? It was in 1865. I do this with my students a lot, and I say, okay, so when would you say that we somehow, as a society, realized that just in schools alone, that black children were worthy of the same resources and the same positive regard and the same smiles from teachers, the same gentle touch as anybody else. And it's like, okay, it's not 1865. Kind of do the experiment and go like, well, what year can we come to? And we can be this conservative. We know it couldn't have been before World War II. So that. What year? What's another? Even just thinking conservatively, what year might you point to? 64, 65, maybe some of the civil rights rulings. 54 could be mentioned, Brown versus Ford. No. Much of Brown was really implemented until the mid-70s, so we're in 1970 something. My own advisor, Gene Mannion, is documenting very much vicious inequality in New Jersey through the 1980s, with Patterson, Tripp, and Camden, and Newark, the black city, identified cities, getting so few of the resources, and actually the legislators saying, like, those people don't really deserve these resources. They don't really need them. They aren't really making much of their lives. So now we're in the 1980s. The relations, the understanding has not changed. It's not to say that the conditions don't change, that I'm not up here giving a talk, and that I will be able to give this talk in 1965, but as we look at the conditions for the vast majority of Black folks, that understanding and that kind of logic, the logic where that inequality is justified and people get elected and elected again. Even presidents can say that some lives, we're just going to lose, and other lives that relation power persists. And so, yeah, so that's kind of why we still use that metaphor. And I keep challenging myself and thinking, oh, is that too much? Is it too much? Athletic slavery, is that too much? And you start thinking like, well, what are those relations? Once you get out of this idea of like, are people still locked in chains, walking around on plantations now? Once you think about slavery as a relation, then it's kind of, okay. So anti-Blackness is in a real sense a kind of political economic activist. This is kind of going into some things I'm interested in, and certainly many of you see actual inequities in terms of resources, material resources. So it's not just feelings or recognition or something that culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally sustained pedagogy would solve. So the master-slave relation is inherently positions the white as a participant in the market and is entitled to consumption and to property. Historically, the Black body has been white property and the object of white consumption. Even now, Black bodies are expected to perform as whites desire, and part of that desire is that Black bodies not be obstacles to white consumption and accumulation. I was talking at this table and talking everywhere I go about how the allocation of education resources, how white families and communities have found ways to make sure that as Black people come in, that they move out, that they find ways in schools. All this is part of this afterlife of slavery, that this idea that Black bodies not be obstacles to white consumption and accumulation. In Seattle, where I grew up and I studied and written about. So as Tiffany King theorizes, Black fungible bodies are the conceptual and discursive fodder through which the settler master can even begin to imagine or think spatial expansion. So this says we got to use these, or move these Black bodies around for our own, the expansion of our territory. And I'm thinking of something Eve Tuck has said that the settler, the white settler, is always willing to give Black folks native land until they want it back. And that's what we're seeing in nearly every city, right? So there's a sense of like, sure, take this kind of urban center, we'll move out here, oh, now we want it back. So now you're gonna have to leave off of that territory. So again, the kind of relation then between the settler mindset and the kind of afterlife of slavery. So Black bodies then are what Tiffany King calls symbols of infinite flux, able to be manipulated, moved, and discarded at will to serve the interests of white domination. So this imagination of Black bodies as fungible justifies not only a metaphorical settlement on and in Black bodies, but also the expansion of white colonial settlement in its material form. So much of the processes of gentrification fit into this category. So in this way, geographic spaces in the city and in urban schools become claims for white settlement as well. I don't know how many schools that began as, we're going to have a diverse school, it's going to be all these things. And then, and it's like, wow, we started for a few years a diverse school, but then what happens is that usually the kind of newly arrived white middle class folks decide, now it's going to be our school. And we're going to find ways to slowly marginalize and marginalize. So we often study these schools and we say, oh, there's sites of possibility at a certain moment, but you come back 5 years later, 10 years later, and whether because Black folks, brown folks, other folks have been pushed out because they can no longer afford to live in the area, or because the school has kind of created these different kinds of tracking kinds of things to kind of keep them on the margins of the school, sometimes in the actual literal basement. Then we find, again, these geographic spaces get settled. Again, another part of the settler colonial relation. So anti-Blackness, even when it's not explicitly voiced, is always embedded within the political economic imaginary of white entitlement to educational spaces and resources. So one of the ways to think about this is a grad student, John Murillo, actually got a faculty position, and I like to pump up people who are just emerging because often they don't get a lot of credit for some of the cutting edge things they're doing. And he talks about black people as just existing out of time, which is the weird thing about this afterlife of slavery, because it's a temporal thing, right? We thought slavery was then. What does it mean to be talking about it as kind of, what time is it? What time was it? What time are we living in? He talks about it as a temporal space of untime. Murillo explains, the truth is, blackness is, he says, blackness is untimely. Time is of a particularly disturbing essence relative to blackness, and this was, is, will be our problem. Lapses, ruptures, loops and repetitions, dispersals, erasures, afterlife, deathliness, ceaselessness, belatedness, earliness. In the anti-black world, virtual and real, imaginary and actual, the descriptors tell us what time tells all about blackness. Time as not just a fundamental feature of how blacks and by extension all others are positioned in the universe, but also as a force, and an arbitrary and violent one at that positions blacks as black. How many times is the statement like, I thought this shit was through, or I thought that was actually, I forget what movie that was on. Actually, it was a documentary, I think, by Marlon Briggs, where somebody experiences anti-blackness. And so, in other words, I thought that the time for this was past. Or haven't we gotten past this? So this notion of time will always reflect in the sense of like, when will this be over? Or it's 2018, it's too late for one thing. And so we're often referencing time and thinking and expressing incredulity about, surely this should be over by now. Or when will this be over? And I'll say this now in terms of untimed, is that I'm now 40-something, which means that I spent 20, just as many years as a professional as I had as a child, right? And so I've had 20-something years of, and many of you, some of you, maybe just a few of you are 40s, where you've actually had now enough adulthood, where you've had 20 years of actually talking the same conversation. Educational inequities and equity and diversity, and we're going to reduce disproportionalities, and we're going to do that, and we haven't done anything. We're having the same conversation. And what I would argue is that there's absolutely nothing that we're currently learning in our classes, that we're currently doing in practice, that promises that 20 years from now, we won't be back here having the same conversation. We'll be wealthier. There's money to be made. This is an industry of diversity, everything. And so I will, be an expert even more so back there. And I'll have all this money. I'll be, hopefully fully tenured, and I'll be like whatever track that they have gone, and there'll be some books and things like that. Like, he's an expert on blah blah blah. I'm an expert on what? 20 years, and what have I done? What have we done? And we'll just be older. We'll be closer to death, and we won't have done a damn thing. There's nothing that we're currently doing. And I say that because, as a hopeful, because the only way to get, this is going to become the metaphor you think about, if you're on a plantation, and you're thinking, if we don't do anything differently, 20 years from now, we're going to still be on the same plantation. So they're going to be doing starkly different. There's nothing we're currently doing. We're being nice to the master. That's not helping. We're picking more stuff. Okay, that's not helping. We can talk about, what it might look like. We can sing some songs. We can do that. All those things. There's nothing. Now, those are useful things to actually mitigate suffering and to keep us perhaps a little more alive and kind of hopeful and still laughing, because laughing, joy, all those things are important. But there's nothing that says in 20 years we won't be doing the same thing. And so what does that mean to think about this definitely as an untimed, right? 20 years from now, we'll be like, well, the disproportionality and blah, 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 and the relations, right? So there's nothing we're currently doing. There's no solutions that are being offered in our educational leadership classes, none of it. And I say that because 20 years ago, and this may sound too pessimistic, but we were saying the same things. We had all these little plans, and we had initiatives, and we had books, textbooks, reducing inequality, and all these things said we were going to do all these things, but there's nothing in the anti-black world, there's nothing in the Southern colony that actually wants to end those relations of power. And so, again, a few of us will get in, we'll see some incremental little tiny little things, but the vast majority of us will be having the same conversations. We'll just be richer. So anyway, for Octavia Butler's character, Dana Franklin, and for Montrevious Thomas, what Murillo describes as black untimed means to experience lapses. For Dana, lapses in the present day as she slips inexplicably into life on the plantation. And for Montrevious, lapses in his regular school experience, and ultimately lapses in childhood, as he slips inexplicably into the anti-black enclosure, to use Damien Sojourner's term, of a school where he can be violently subdued by the overseer, to be treated as never possibly a child. Body slam. Body slam. never possibly a child. So much more to say here about loops, and deathliness, and erasures. All of these features of Black untime in Dana's life, and Montravious' life, and all of our Black lives. So, but let me pause for a minute because anti-Blackness is difficult to discuss. It's overwhelming. It hurts deeply. And I've said a lot of painful words. Whenever I teach this in classes, I've had graduate students, mostly Black graduate students, actually cry. It's been difficult for them to even learn that. And it's not, and I have occasionally the student who wants to refuse it, and then they go, I have too much evidence of the, not like, oh, this is all true, it's like it's true or false, but the sense of, I have too much evidence of Black untime, I have too much evidence of Black suffering, I have too much evidence of being disregarded as a teacher, or seeing my students disregarded, or not matter. And so it's what does it mean, though, to actually sit with it? We're going to do some stuff with it. And this is leading somewhere besides just a hollowness, besides just a weight. But the weight is important. The weight is important. Because unless you actually get to the point of going, they're killing you. If they're killing you, you do something different than if they're discriminating against you, or there's bias, a good implicit bias. No, it's actually matters of life and death. Matters of life and death. If they're killing your child, what would you do? Far differently than if you thought that, oh, there's something they need to understand about the differences in the cultural. It's a very different conversation. Very different conversation. You heard me mention Damien Sojourner's book, First Strike, his new book. He contends that the past 40 years have witnessed collusion between state, economic, political, criminal justice, and education to, in his words, quote, disrupt and or neutralize Black social visions of freedom. This project affects and infects every dimension of school life. As Sojourner argues here, the removal of Black arts, music, and other cultural knowledges from the curriculum is not simply about a lack of cultural relevance or diversity, but an intentional effort to undermine the emancipation of Black people, to keep Black people, and particularly Black children and youth, bracketed off from the fertile ground of collective imaginations. Of course, even within enclosure, there is resistance, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but what Sojourner offers here is an understanding of the anti-Black intentionality of education policy and practice. So much about controlling Black bodies in schools, it's like sit there, shut up, all that kind of severity, and that. I saw a video, I know her last, Christine Dial, I don't know, I remember her name, it's a white teacher in New York who was caught on video yelling at the first graders that got the math problem wrong. She said, go sit in the corner. I hate it when you get it wrong. She like yells, and then the private, what's her name, who heads the whole private network of schools that in New York know her, and she said, you know, she just cares about whether the children go to college. First graders. Again, that's the adultification of Black children. Why would you be concerned about whether a first grader is going to college? In the sense of not a 4-year situation when their first grader loves to learn or feels the expression of their creativity. But I'm going to college. And so therefore, I need to punish them severely in the way that one might punish a 12th grader. You know, it's like, hey, you're going to college next year, you need this kind of discipline, and da-da-da. Even though it's inappropriate, you would still like berate them in front of everyone. But it's okay to do so with a Black child. Because again, imagine if you have a slave and they're not behaving as you wish, sometimes you actually have to treat them more harshly because there's a thought that the Black body needs, the brain somehow can't process unless it's brutal. Brutality becomes a norm, right? And so, and actually this isn't just me, there's actually research that suggests that, not suggests, that actually finds that people believe that Black bodies can endure more pain, that actually doesn't hurt, certain things don't hurt them as much. Other research that shows that that actually doctors and nurses, I don't know if nurses or doctors, are less likely to touch, actually get physical touch to Black patients with cancer conditions. There's also research that says that people are more likely to identify Black children, the faces of Black children with primates, monkeys. Again, more animalistic. So this research is already, it's kind of out there. And that's not on some kind of like oh, this kind of diversity thing. Actually, Black bodies are uniquely seen as primates, unlike any of the other bodies. There's a specificity of Blackness that says, well, if you like a monkey, well, we're going to lose the monkeys, but you wouldn't lose a human being. So that association is there. So again, this is not cheerful, so I just don't imagine the cheerful part of it. There is one here. But it's important to meditate on this is how serious it is. It's this serious. If people actually don't even want to touch, they don't want to touch black people who are suffering medically in the same way that they're going to touch white bodies, and let alone all the research that talks about how we're less likely to be offered MRIs and other kinds of things that can come in complaining of illnesses that's explained away. Montravius, of course, is hurting, and they say, oh, you're faking it, and he loses his leg. I mean, these things are all part of, I'm starting to see these connections here. And all this is, depressingly as it may seem, metaphorically, the afterlife of slavery helps to explain some of this. I'm going to, I have some examples from getting the right to education, and some examples of education, kind of what it looks like in ways that are not like people losing their leg necessarily, or actual Shakara, who was, you saw that video where she was in North Carolina, I believe it was, where the police officer basically slammed her in her desk and dragged her across the floor. It turns out actually, when you know her story, her mother just died. She was actually, she had no parents. She was in foster home. And there's a lot of things going on that in a human story we would actually care, but in this case, the narrative, and if you read comments, which we're trying to read comments in the newspaper, it was like, well, if she'd only done it, she'd done it. But if it had been a white student, it would have been like, well, we need to know her story. Maybe she's suffering mental health things or something like that. But even aside from those outrageous cases of those videos, just in the normative things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about My Brother's Keeper, which many of us are familiar with. There's the critique of My Brother's Keeper, which obviously Kimberly Crenshaw and others have made in terms of its lack of gender inclusiveness, and its sense of really, my particular was like basically, in a lot of performance you had like maybe black boys were here and black girls were here in some measure of performance, and we're like, wow, this inequity, this is why we need to pay attention to black boys. This is why we need to pay attention to black boys. Turns out white girls are here, white boys are here, and white girls are here, and we're paying attention to this bit of inequity, and then we end up fixating on gender as this kind of thing, as opposed to thinking about how white supremacy and how white supremacy and inclusion of class end up making this gap, this huge one. So let's say that we'll equal that out a little bit. Okay, now we're going to bring black boys up to black girls, or even in the percentage of teachers. I think about 80-something% of teachers are white women. I think it's about 4 or 5%, maybe 7% are black women, 2% are black men. And so there's all these missions. We need to get more black male teachers, and although that may be true, one, they probably become expensive black women teachers. So then you're going to kind of even that out. So maybe you'll have 3 or 4% of each, it'll be a little equity. But you haven't addressed the larger gap here, and you've called yourself really doing some kind of radical work. And so again, not wanting to attend to the anti-blackness of it, and instead kind of setting up this battle between black men and black women, who were kind of like, who hurts more, and that. But whose interests are served by that fixation are 2% and 7% of black teachers, when 80-something% of teachers are white women. Anyway, so I want to explore here just the logics that idealize My Brother's Keeper as a solution to the problems of black young men and boys, and that serve to make the program legible to a variety of publics, from policymakers to educators to black men. So of course we want to support My Brother's Keeper. Oh wow, there's some money, there's effort to do something that's positive. So it may not be surprising that the rationale for My Brother's Keeper relies on deficit-based representations of black young men and boys. They lack interest in education, they lack the ability to delay gratification, they're preoccupied with not acting right, and they're misguided in their pursuit of careers in hip-hop and professional sports. That was kind of the kind of whole plot of My Brother's Keeper. However, I want to argue that My Brother's Keeper also appropriates positive tropes of black collective identity and racial uplift from the very name of the initiative. Although it said it was about boys and young men of color, My Brother's Keeper, all these things were pretty much, blackness was really at the center of its imagination, of the problem, and you'll see that in a second. And it's kind of focused on racial familial responsibility. We're focused on the importance of elders as mentors and role models, to its promise of reinvigorating organizations that help black people help themselves. Wonderful stuff. So even as it's intended to be inclusive of all boys and young men of color, I contend the imagination of the problem is excitedly and specifically black. You'll see this in a second. My focus on blackness is not intended to render these other groups of color invisible. Rather, my analysis proceeds with the understanding that it is the deployment of blackness and anti-blackness that most heavily informs the racial neoliberal logics of My Brother's Keeper. So the problem with My Brother's Keeper is not its individual parts. Worthy goals that might be related to mentoring and job training programs, early childhood readiness, reforms of school discipline policies. I totally understand why community advocates and educators and others might voice support for My Brother's Keeper and even seek to be involved in the grant competitions and all of that. With declining federal and state investment in education and all that, it's kind of those few things that are there, like get some of those dollars to something. So my critique here is that these arguably beneficial programs are being advanced in a neoliberal project intended to undermine more fundamental changes by locating problems within the bodies of black boys and young men rather than in the social and economic order. My Brother's Keeper initiatives are proffered not as public investments in the public good, but as private sector technical solutions to the perceived cultural problems of a specific group, the problem of blackness itself, and then gendered blackness. So not only does My Brother's Keeper legitimize neoliberalism, it also subverts efforts to imagine and then push for the deep structural changes that are desperately needed to make a significant change in the life chances and maturities of black young men and boys. So there's a bit of this analysis here. Here's a town hall, July 21st, 2014. President Obama, I'm thinking on a lot today. Okay. Just because, in some ways, before President Obama, I think that black people had a kind of tentative relationship with the U.S. nation state. A kind of sense that this is their country, we're living in it, we're do what we can, and so there's an inherent critique of that U.S. nation state. It wasn't we, it was kind of they, the United States is they, and we have to kind of, we in some kind of sense of tension with that. With President Obama, we started cheering bombings. That was our guy. We wanted to win. For him to win, he has to succeed at bombing, Syria, succeed at bombing things. And so in some ways, we became on the side of the U.S. nation state and defensive of that U.S. nation state in ways that we never had been before. And so it allowed him to then do things that escaped our critique because what he did indeed suffer racial, anti-black assaults. And so we didn't want to be critiquing him, but then it put us in this weird place. And there's also romance with this idea, and I remember sitting there going, wow, there are black hair care products in the White House. It has a kind of intimacy, Jill Scott's doing a concert in the White House. This is like something, there's a way, that intimacy though, makes us a little too close to the U.S. nation state in a way that we've never been before. So in some ways, I think I started saying I'm ready for white presidents again. Just with that tension is necessary. Anyway, President Obama is giving this town hall at this Washington, D.C. school to promote My Brother's Keeper. And he said the aim of the event was to students from around the nation that kind of gathered here, was to give me a chance to hear from you about what your concerns are, what your dreams and hopes are, what your fears are, and how you think we might be able to help. And of course, this was done after the program had already been constructed, and now so nobody really wants to hear from young people. Let's be clear. This is all a facade. This is all, as Mary Smith said, it's political spectacle. So he then noted, this is the very next thing he said, he noted how he was similar to many of the young men in the room. And I cringe at this notion of young men when they're actually boys. For black boys, we often start calling them young men. And like, when did young men begin? Oh, 11, 12. What are you talking about? We have the case of, was it Ryan Lochte, who committed the crime down in Brazil, and they said, oh, he's just a boy, he's 32. So white people maintain boyhood, or this access to childhood, well into their 30s, when you have black children being adultified, as Anna Ferguson talks about in Bad Boys, and it's been documented in so many places. So I insist on boyhood, on really thinking about, and that's why Joseph Nelson and I wrote this piece on reimagining black boyhood on Harvard Ed Review. Just really trying to put boyhood back in. Even when they graduate, they're still boys. Boys. Now, I know that the pushback on that is like, well, we've been called boy for so long that we want to kind of claim our manhood, but often that manhood is the excuse for not actually treating us as vulnerable, as children, as having feelings, as hurting, as wanting to giggle. We don't get any of that. So our curriculum, our rote curriculum, all those things are about, we need to prepare these, Christine and I in school had to prepare that first grader for adulthood. right? There's no concern about whether that child. And we also have policies where schools that serve more black and brown children actually often have fewer minutes of recess. If you pay attention in some districts, they say, well, they don't need recess, they need to stay in the ready to learn position. So all this, so I really insist on boyhood as this kind of way of also pushing back against the anti-blackness, which says that black children are never children. Imagine, in slavery, at the age of 2 and 3, you were already picking up sticks, beginning work. You were never a child. You were a plaything of the master's children, but that was not you being a child, it was you serving this function for them as a toy, an object. So what does it mean to kind of repossess, to insist on childhood, to insist on giggling and playing and being a fool, because everybody else is allowed that. So anyway, the president said to the students at the town hall, like me, he said, he acted out, he made some bad choices, he didn't take school as serious as he should have, and made excuses sometimes for misbehavior. This is the way he characterized the similarity between him and these boys that are gathered here in this town hall. That was what he identified. And I think that was exactly the very first words, and those were the direct quotes. Acted out, made some bad choices, didn't take school as serious as he should have, made excuses sometimes for misbehavior. So here then, as on other occasions, the president begins his discussion of my brother's keeper by framing boys and young men of color, and I really argue this anti-blackness work here, as socially and morally troubled. There is no mention of structural, economic, or racial inequality aside from a subtle reference to the fact that in his own life, he, quote unquote, often had a second chance, or often got a third chance. Remember, President Obama had no black relatives, except for the one that had left, African, and so therefore also was constructed outside of U.S. blackness, even in the imagination of that person. So he all had white relatives around him. So, and he also acknowledged that his mistakes were unlikely to have been shot or landed in jail. Also here, the president only refers to the adolescents as young men as never as boys, so that's my problem there. So anyway, after the speech, the president asked for questions from the audience, explaining that, quote, we want the mayors who are here and the business leaders who are here to hear directly from you. The first two questions followed the same social moral development framing offered by the president. Hello, good afternoon, I'm Jamal. My question is, did you set goals for yourself when you were younger? My name is Grace Smith and I'm from DC, and my question is, how do you cope with judgment and how people see you? So again, it's kind of like, how can I act better? How can I do better? Because obviously, in my body, I'm morally, inept, suspect, disgusting. So the third one came from a student who identified himself as being from Montana. So my question for you, Mr. President, is how the United States government is helping American Indian people revitalize our language and culture. Because so many of our young men and boys don't know who they are because they've lost their culture and language, and the United States government has tried so hard for the past 200 years to destroy that. So unlike the first two questions, this one was decidedly policy-oriented and pointed directly to the impact on indigenous youth of intentional state-sponsored colonial and racial terror. The president began his response by noting that he had recently been on an Indian reservation in South Dakota, and recounted his heartbreaking experience hearing Native young men and women's life stories. So again, already constructed as heartbreaking. He also acknowledged their loss of connections to ancestors and memories, again, it's in the past, and noted how important it was for Native youth to be proud of their past. I'm time to, that's all in the past. But then came the pivot, in which he reminded the Native questioner that we live in the 21st century, and instructed him that you can't just live in the past. He went on to explain that, quote, young Native Americans are also going to have to learn math, science, computer sciences, engineering, that even as young Native people are looking back to your roots, they will have to adapt to what is increasingly a world culture. Here then, the president troublingly positions Native culture and history as constructed in the past, and not as something living and growing in the now. Native culture and connection is useful for social and emotional grounding in his view, but only to the extent that it can be put into the service of personal and national economic advancement. And in terms of individual social mobility and the nation's needs in the global marketplace, that requires Native youth to dedicate themselves to study of the hard sciences and technology. And then came another pivot, in which the president, still having not addressed the policy question which the young person posed to him, returns to the framing of personal effort and moral choice, and almost seamlessly brings the discussion back to the problem of black young people. This is a quote, I think I have it here. That's my brother's problem. This is a quote here. I think that one of the things this is true not just for Native Americans, remember we were answering a question from a Native student, but it's also true for African Americans. Sometimes African Americans, there's been the notion of acting white, which sometimes is overstated, but there's an element of truth to it where, okay, if boys are reading too much, then, well, why are you doing that? Or why are you speaking so properly? And the notion that there's some authentic way of being black, that if you're going to be black, you have to act a certain way and wear a certain kind of clothes, that has to go. So, several things are accomplished here in this quote. I'm going to ask you all, what's in this quote? What's happening here?
Seems to be a definition of what it potentially means like to act like.
Yes, it's a kind of structure of what it means to act white. Reading too much, speaking so properly, in other words, mastery of standard English, what clothes one wears, and that this is a problem. He says, which sometimes is overstated, but there's an element of truth to it. And part of the reason he says that is because he knows the researchers. The researchers have pushed back on that and said, this isn't, actually you're not only overstating, you're misstating what the phenomenon really is. And I'll talk about that in a second. But so he knows better than to kind of say too much about it, but he's kind of going to commit to it anyway, because this is our kind of, well, acting white is the problem. Again, a behavioral thing. This kind of fear of embracing these things that white are somehow seen to own, but we need to lay claim to. And also just kind of flip, because I don't know whether, he slips back to black folks. He's talking to a Native questioner, and so he's basically telling the Native questioner that he needs to not worry about acting white. But here's the thing I've said about this, in terms of acting white. If you go back to some of the theorization on anti-blackness, you realize that that black people didn't come up with acting white. White people did. White people constructed schools as my undergraduates. They're having a hard time wrapping their heads around reading Carter Woodson's Miseducation, where he's talking about schools that were benevolent schools, like white people funded them. They said, yes, we're going to come to our schools. But the people never believed that black people were intellectually equal to them. They actually saw them as we're morally superior, we're intellectually superior, and we need to take care of you savages lest you become too wild or don't do the things that we need to teach you the way. So the schools were constructed as white supremacists. In other words, education was constructed as, to be involved in education was, we're going to either teach you to act white as best you can, but you'll never be able to be us. But that's really how schools were constructed. Schools were constructed as anti-black from the beginning. And so to have a critique of that is not a critique of acting white, it's a critique of actual white supremacy. So if you rethink the whole critique, when young people are actually often critiquing acting white, one, we know that in segregated black schools, there was never that. People weren't like, oh, you're learning, that's acting white. I mean, people in black schools, that was not really a part of the question at all. It's only when you have these integrated schools where white people say, we're gonna teach you now. And you know that when schools were integrated, they fired a lot of black teachers and administrators, so those effectively became integrated schools were white schools that black people were invited into. So schooling was always constructed as, was a white supremacist project. So to have a critique of that is not inherently some kind of like black illusion. And so as I talk to my undergraduates about it, they still didn't get it because it's, okay, so I was talking about one school, which talks about where the white principal did not allow black students to come into his, when he had black guests, they couldn't be entertained in his club. He's a principal of a black school, but black people are not allowed into his home. So in other words, you have a principal, this is overtly a case where you have a white supremacist principal of a black school. This is not a mystery to a lot of us, how that would be possible. But they were, so they said, okay, so the white people perceived that the schooling was racist. No, they didn't just perceive that it was racist. This is a safe thing we can say, that the white folks who ran these schools said, oh yeah, this is a white supremacy. I mean, they would use the term white supremacy, but they would definitely say, oh yes, white people are more valued, we're more intelligent, we're more morally worthy, and we're providing education for you. And so in some ways, by definition, the schools were white supremacists. But they kept, as the students, they had a hard time, just as people do now in classes, oh, so it's a perception on the part of the black students that there's bias, and that no. The schools are constructed against black life. It's not in their heads. It's not just a perception. The schools are constructed that way. And so the question becomes for us in this kind of period of time is, when and in what ways are our schools consciously resisting the ways that they've been constructed? This is the way all schooling was constructed. So at what point does it change? At what point will it change in that unkind piece? I don't know where we are. I don't know what moment we are in this afterlife of slavery, but if it didn't change in 1865, it didn't change in 1975, our schools are still in this process of possession of black bodies and believing the curriculum on so many levels. Those of us who are doing work on curriculum, we find examples all the time where the curriculum is set against black people's lives and bodies. And so when are we? Where are we? In relation to this time that Carter G. Woodson, let's just go back to the 1930s, I think, is talking about, that even my students have a hard time thinking of outside of, it's the perception of the black students that might be racist. It's like, your principal does not let black people in his home. There might be a problem there in everything, And at my last class, I was like, can I, because they were sitting there like, and I wonder if this is something that we're overwhelmed or we just don't do with them. I said, can you, you're sitting there, maybe they're overwhelmed, maybe they're just like really like, I just can't see this, but I wanted them to see the face, the heart of the parent who sends their child to that school, knowing that the people that they're putting them in the care of despise them, despise their mind, despise their flesh, don't believe they're beautiful, and yet that may be the only opportunity for some kind of training or something. But what is that heaviness? What is that heaviness that is there? And the heaviness is there in 1933. The heaviness is there when my mother had to talk with me. She said, I need you to know, they may not believe that you're as a judge, I need you to know that you're able, and if they say anything, you need to come and tell me, and I'll be up at that school. If you're acting up, I'll be on you. But if the school is doing it, I will definitely take care of that. Right? And so she's still having that conversation with me in the 1970s. When are we? What moment is this? I don't know. Anyway, enough of that one. So anyway, that's I have some other steps to my work, but I want to have some more time that we can actually just kind of talk. So I want to actually skip ahead and think about fugitivity, the good stuff, because it's running away. It's like the only thing we get to do. So this is something I was having a conversation on the table about. We were thinking, well, what's to be done, right? What's to be done? And if we actually say that there's nothing we're currently doing that promises that, and if I'm laying out this like really stark, metaphor, reality, and flesh kind of thing of slavery, and I'm talking a lot about death and suffering, well, in some ways that's depressing. In other ways it's motivating, because it's like, okay, what would you do if you actually really believed, if you actually really came to a sense of like, you're trying to kill us? What, you do a whole lot of different things than if you think like, they're discriminating against us, there's a little bias. It calls for something, a more drastic measure. They're dying, right? Their lives are being cut short. Every time, an example from my articles where the white teacher is telling the whole 6th grade honors class, write this story, you can write a story about anything you want. And I raise my hand, oh, can I write a story in my grandmother's accent? And it's honors class, and the only black child, and she's smiling at everybody. She turns to me and her smile goes away. No. And she turns her head back. She's like, that's a kind of death in that moment. This is happening every single day. That's not something to be allowed. That's not something to be permitted. That's not something to just have another class about next year and the next year and the next year, a nice little diversity class. One class, often, and then you let these people go teach our children. You know they aren't ready. We know they're not ready. This calls for, really? I don't know how many people I talk to in teacher education, and they say, yeah, we have this one little diversity class, and we're so desperate to get teacher candidates because there's a shortage of teachers in our area, so they let all sorts of people in, and then we have this unit, and then the students say all sorts of ignorant things, and then they have to kind of pass them, and then they're in the classroom. Killing us. So there's something drastic. If you think about it that way, you got to intervene. There's got to be something stronger than what we're doing, because we're letting our children die. So, I think this is what makes this work unwelcome in a field like education. We're a nice field, is what Les Billings has said in our explanation of how critical race theory disrupts what we would like to believe about ourselves. We are invested in and we believe in our institutions and in the the idea of incremental change. Our field is almost built around that, right? So a little change this year, and a little change next year, and a little change next year. 20 years from now, we're still in the same place, but we keep telling ourselves this story about incremental change. We see ourselves as earnest, as caring about all children, and we're committed to implementing practical, realistic, measurable reforms. Even acknowledging injustice and inequality, we believe we should focus our energies on doing what little bit we can in the system that we have. And I'm not here to disparage that. In fact, I would say that in many ways, the way I would talk about that is we're trying to mitigate suffering. We're trying to stand in the way of keeping people from killing who we can. So and that's work that has to be done. Somebody better be there trying to save what we can. But I am deeply interested in doing what we can do now to save as many lives as we can. And at the same time, I believe that there's no Black emancipation without a radical disruption, dismantling, and reimagination of the very conditions, the very logics, the very ontologies that reproduce Black death. And reproducing Black death over and over again is all we currently know how to do, all we can currently imagine, all that the white settler can desire. Frantz Fanon said that decolonization, which sets out to change, more bright on. It was great all by myself. I just kind of rereading that story. So decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. We're talking about blowing things up. And I say, we're not physically blowing things up. There's got to be a way that in our minds, in our curricula, in our way we think about blowing things up. In other words, the very logics, the very kind of, we have to create a space where we go, okay, all those are dead ends. And I mean dead ends as in death. And so what does it mean to totally think outside, and part of we talk about thinking outside the box, right? And maybe it's an extreme version of that, but it's at least, that's a weak, that never really results in actually really, because the box is still usually inside, the very structure is, but it's blowing up the box and thinking of other shapes, other ways, other forms, other ways of moving. We're going to have to think other than the plantation life. So just as decolonization requires a return of the land, full stop, so does Black emancipation require the end of the master, the end of whiteness, the end of settlement. The master cannot set us free. The master in that relation must be destroyed. So Frank Wilkerson explains that Black liberation as a prospect makes radicalism more dangerous to the U.S. This is not because it raises the specter of an alternative polity such as socialism or community control, but because its conditions of possibility and gesture of resistance function as a negative dialectic, a politics of refusal and a refusal to affirm, a program of complete disorder. One must embrace its disorder, its incoherence, and allow oneself to be elaborated by it, if indeed one's politics are to be underwritten by a desire to take down this country. And this is, Frank Wilkerson is one of the, definitely would describe himself as an Afro-pessimist. But I want to sit with this in a second, because he said, there's not just another little program or another different way of organizing, but some way to get kind of think about a politics of refusal. Again, Eve Tuck, in talking about decolonization, says that refusal is not just a saying no. But that would be no, right? But it actually, one is the beginning of some other possibility, because some things only become possible when you say no to some things. When you say, this is not working. This cannot continue. So then, okay, this cannot continue. We're going to talk about this, like, what might else there be? What other ways of thinking about how we relate to one another, how we relate to the land, how we relate to, what might be possible? But you can't do that if you're still holding on to, well, we can do this little change in this little culture development. And it's not that though I'm disparaging those things only accomplish mitigating a bit of suffering for a few people. If you're actually interested in not being here 20 years from now and having the vast majority of our people be dead, then you have to actually think beyond that. A program of complete disorder. Well, that's not good. I mean, we're about order. We're about actually developing program that you can actually develop a grant proposal for, and the U.S. government will fund it. And so everything we do is about order. Everything about educational leadership of all things is really about order. I should mention that when I was teaching at Cal State Long Beach, which was my first faculty position when I was at Cognitive Leadership, And I also taught in a program called Social and Cultural Analysis of Education, which is similar to what I teach at Berkeley. And that was mostly first generation Latinx students who were from Santa Ana and East LA. And they tended to think about the schools and the system in terms of they. And when they talked about interest, they said, well, what do our people want? What do our people need? What are our imaginations? What are our dreams? In an education leadership program, the students there, which is a diverse group, tended to think about, when they said we, they talked about in terms of the school system, the structure. And they're much more defensive. They also made a lot more money. And they were in the program knowing that they would make a lot more money after they graduated. And in terms of their job security, there's a number of other things going on. But what I'm pointing to is the sense of what happens to us the longer we stay in educational leadership and we become higher and higher, is that our identification becomes not with the needs of a disorder that our communities might need, but in keeping the order of the system itself. And a faith in that system. What does it mean to work in a system but not believe in it? So that's kind of what I'm talking about, the sense of like, I'm not saying quit your jobs, I'm saying that don't identify with it. The institution is not there to save our peoples. That's not what it's there for. I mean, in so many ways, there's a way of, where subversion, you start hearing that subversion becomes inherently necessary. In a sense of like, sitting in the meetings, you're doing things, and you're like, okay, this is what the system and the structure wants, but when you start saying we, and that we includes the very structures of power, you have lost already, and you're lost, and we've lost. So there's always, what does it mean to always maintain a kind of tension between, like, and understanding this critical theory 101, that the way power works is that and it's always there's a suspicion, it has an inherent and internal suspicion of power. The power is not interested in the lives of those who don't have power. Right? And so what does it mean to stay on the side of those? You're confused.
I think power is ultra interested
Oh.
in the lives of people who have no power, because it's exceptionally invested in maintaining that,
Yes.
farming that energy.
Yes, you said that better than I did. But yeah, it's definitely invested in and attentive to that. But its attention to it is not on the side of like expanding, freedom or anything like that. So if you think about that, power is definitely invested in maintaining its own power, and to do that, it has to invest in the death, to use the stuff out here. So you have to think like, oh, the system is invested in the death of, in this case, black children, brown children, native children. It's invested in the death of that. Like, oh, that can't be true. We're part of the system. We love children at this school. So what does it mean to kind of, and that's where we live. A lot of you already know this tension, right? It's like, I'm in the system trying to do what I can, but I know that this structure is not for us. And so how do we actually teach in our programs to have a new generation so that the we that they speak of, the we to which they love most, is not the structure of the system itself. And more than that, they're eternally suspicious and know that power, its investment, is often against that life. It's kind of like on a plantation, knowing you're there, but you know that master is not, no matter how many extra little bits of fat they give you on holidays, where they let you get off an hour early for Christmas, they don't love you, and they really are not interested in your freedom. So what we have in the meantime is fugitivity. So fugitivity is this concept here. That's what's possible. This is how we allow ourselves to be elaborated by disorder. In education, this might inspire a commitment to education practice and action that refuses captivity, even as it's not yet freedom. So Jared Sexton has written, again, this is all very, this would be dismissed as like, okay, this is all out there in the times, so this is not very tangible. But tangible stuff can come from imagining outside and then spending some time with each other, going like, okay, what would that look like? What would that look like? And what might that look like? And fugitivity is never going to look like, it's not going to be freedom, it's going to be running. But there's something good about that. There's something about that uncertainty, that not knowing if you're going to get caught. But that's the only way you can ever be free, is to actually have this space, this time of fugitivity. So Jared Sexton, he said, we might wonder aloud about how blackness might be thought, which is also to say presented and represented in an anti-black world that shapes and structures every aspect of black existence, except or including whatever escapes. Fugitivity is not freedom, or not yet. What might a black girl or woman do with her own body, or with her child or kin, or in her own dwelling, or on the printed page, in song, in flight? It may be that the remedy to dispossession lies not in the spirit of claiming or reclaiming possession, but in the paradox of an even greater and willed dispossession. In other words, winning is not like somehow getting more of the goodies that the system has, but in a sense, almost further running away, further tension, a further tension. So not necessarily inclusion, necessarily. We're talking about equity and inclusion. But inclusion is like always, like I said, inclusion of a few people, but it's never going to let the vast majority of our people in. So there is Black life, even when we're talking about social death. And as David Marriott puts it, he says, the form of Black social life is essentially one of fugitivity. Blackness is insofar far as it is not, for it can never be whiteness. And so the sense of like always, that's where you live most. And so that's the happy part. You're actually most alive when you're most in the fugitive space, when you're most thinking about escape and running away of other possibilities. And some of you probably have these like informal or formal kind of ways that you get together with people who envision something totally different. And you're like, we just need to, and you might think, oh, what's the use of this? Oh, it's very useful. That's when you're planning escape. You're planning escape. Because there's no way that in 20 years we will escape if we haven't been planning for it. Some people plan those escapes for decades and decades. They plotted, they got information, they sifted it together, and then they may have sent one person out, that person tested it out. They may come back and say, okay, this is how we're going to do it. I have space for more of you. But it's always a long-term plan. You didn't just say, we're only going to be practical. We're going to be practical. And fugitivity is never practical. Freedom is never practical. Because in all likelihood, you're going to be strung up somewhere. That's what's going to happen to some people. We're going to suffer. We try to do what we can to like be there for those folks and to support them and like and get yourself in a position where you can let somebody kind of have you have the power to actually let maybe some innovative thing happen that wouldn't normally happen. But generally, it's going to be a lot of running and sneaking. Well, Fred Milton says that fugitivity requires an embrace of life on the run. And so here's what he says. He says, we cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down the structures that right now limit our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know lie outside its walls. And he goes on and says, he says, never being on the right side of the Atlantic, which again is the middle passage, is an unsettled feeling, a feeling of a thing that unsettles with others. It's a feeling, if you ride with it, that produces a certain distance from the settled, from those who determine themselves in space and time, who locate themselves in a determined history. To have been shipped is to have been moved by others, with others. It is to feel at home with the homeless, at ease with the fugitive, at peace with the pursued. What does it mean to have a professional life at peace with the pursued? We know our students are, not feeling free. So what does it mean to join them and also taking on at least as much of the danger that they may feel? So the possibility of free Black people, of free Black children, is only found in fugitivity. Fugitivity is not yet freedom, but as Moten makes clear, fugitivity is the journey, the always undetermined and unsettled journey to Black freedom. We need to get our children out of here. Just one last scholar. Oh, yeah. So there's one less scholar that I'll introduce here, Solange Knowles. In an interlude track, Dad Was Mad, her father, Matthew Knowles, reflects on his own childhood at the beginning of school integration.
I was first, one of the first. My first day was thankful for coming, put me in the back seat of the car, meeting with other black kids with 6 of us. Seeing our parents and also KKK members having signs and throwing cans at us, spitting at us. We lived in the threat of death every day, every day. So I was just lost. It was battling between integration and segregation and racism. That was my childhood. I was angry for years. Angry. Very angry.
Imagine that generation, just every day. And this is not the people that were caught an eyes on the prize, but just a school, somewhere I don't know where, they're in Texas. I don't know how long they've been in Houston, the Knolls. So we have to talk about how traumatic and violent school desegregation has been for black children, something Du Bois warned about as early as 1934, in arguing that we should not send our children to schools where they'll be spat on and despised. And if we do find that they are spat upon, despised, body slammed, we're going to need to take things to another level. We're going to have to seriously consider that they are trying to kill us and respond accordingly. So here Solange wants to consider the possibility of fugitivity in a kind of black rage. And the next track which follows, Dad is Mad, is a track called Mad. And she's singing here. So there's this concept of being mad. That being mad is actually essentially generative. That we have a right to be mad. And all this first say, oh, you shouldn't be so mad, you should be so angry, you should be more measured, you should be practical. And that there's actually something that one might embrace in being mad. But the song actually, importantly, I think, begins this way. She says, what I think about this is the notion of a collective thing. It's not something you can kind of do alone. None of this is work that you can kind of do alone. You really do need people to do this with. And so I'm hoping that in the classes here, in your plans, and the kind of future spaces you can create in districts, that you're doing this with other people. Because she actually talks about this, there's actually joy. There's joy that can be found in that actual fugitivity, even though it's not yet freedom. So it must be a collective process, and there's light and there's joy in the face of anti-black violence if we be mad together. I think the escape from the plantation begins with anger. You got the right to be mad about how black children are treated in societies and in public schools. You got the right to be mad and the responsibility to run on deeper into the dark. Look like? I think maybe that's what we're left with. What does this look like in terms of the work you're already doing? That's kind of, in some ways, not act like nobody's doing anything. We're doing some things. Like, what do you think is the possibility of maybe something you're already doing with other people, since it's a collective process? Like, what's going on that you think may offer us just some little bit or move toward some fugitive space or possibility or something? Anything that you inspired to recently, just something.
I kind of want to talk about the first part.
Okay.
It's all the other stuff. It's, this is I haven't been in California long, and I worked at a school in Brentwood, and the comment that I was gonna make is that as a black man, black educator, I feel like I had to deal with a lot of the hurdles that students deal with. I had a teacher who was complimenting me on the work that I do with students, and he called me a boy. He said it took a boy from New York to come and do good work with these kids. And I,
Which beyond even just being called a boy, the very sentiment that it took.
yeah, and there were all these other undertones within that, but I was angry, and I didn't know how to respond, and I was mad at myself for not saying anything, because I didn't say anything, because it totally caught me off guard. And I had another point last year, it was my first year, and I went, I don't know many people here, and I went to like this teacher function, and we had this thing, it was at a bar, food, so I got some chicken wings, and I was like, all right, let me go up and say what's up, and one of the other teachers said, man, that's to see you didn't shy away from the stereotype. And I was like, I'm gonna punch this dude in his face. But I knew that also being mad would also be wrong, right? Like that I'd be playing into this dude's the aggressive black dude. You know, he wants to punch me, he wants to fight. So I just wanted to share that because it's been tough trying to be the black man at the school. But they brought me in to help the children, but they also don't include me when there's conversations about how do we help, right? Because it's the white folks want to. This is our conversation. You know, we'll figure this out.
This is backed up by, I don't know if you read, by Ed Brockenrose written about this. He also written about this more recently. Just reviewing an article, but basically about black male teachers and kind of the sense of we just hired him at Berkeley. Travis Britton. Oh, actually, it's funny. Yeah, Travis.
It is why.
And it's like, we hired his last name is Tolani Britton. Wow. But he's written about this too in terms of how black teachers are hired as kind of these magic Negroes, kind of doing these things, but yet you're not necessarily fit in them. And so that's something to think about in terms of our whole, how we're training the next generation of education leaders and how we're training them to think about like what magic black males, and also you have to be a certain kind of black male. There are black males who are just not seen as masculine enough or fatherly enough or whatever enough to actually be the kind of black male or big enough because there's a sense that you're going to fill this role of father, of disciplinarian, of all these things, of heteropatriarchal kind of leader. And so those black males who fail to meet those things, often even by black education leaders, just think it's like, oh, you're not the kind of black male we need. So there's these constrictions of like what kind you have to be even to do that. And then of course you have to be noble and stay in your place, blah. And the research definitely points a lot to that. And that's not just your experience, but it's been even how people imagine, like, you need to hire some black males. What's in their imagination when they say that? What kind of work they expect them to do. And so often they're not given, nobody really cares about their professional advancement or all those things. It's kind of like, are you helping us to do this work, to oversee? This population is our problem population. I would say that my friend Misha Mosley, who's also a Berkeley PhD grad, has a new project that's actually got some work going on in the Bay and in New York. It's a project called the Black Teacher Project, and she's actually had a number of things with chicken wings and other things that gather black teachers together to kind of talk about their experiences, but also what supports they need. And she's been pressed by a lot of people to help, a lot of districts to help them recruit black teachers. And first, before we recruit any more, we're going to find about how to make sure that black teachers are thriving emotionally, healthy, professionally. And that seems like really where you're at in terms of like, okay, you got me in the school system, and so you recruited me, but how do I feel this is, that I'm sustained here, just in terms of my emotional health, my purpose here. There's some things that the school will never be and will never do, or will take a long less time. So sometimes you need to find spaces of refuge. And obviously, some of those teacher functions are not necessarily spaces of refuge. And so I would suggest seeing what the Black Teacher Project is doing in the Bay Area, just as a place to kind of like go and talk and see what kind of, they're not even trying to make you do anything. They're just trying to like kind of hear, and they will report back off in the districts in the sense like, here's what we're hearing from the Black teachers in terms of what they need to thrive. Before you're recruiting, make sure you have these structures in place. But it's also just it's a fun move.
And then just the second part that I want to say is that historically, like, even when Black folks have thrived, right, when we figured out ways to educate our communities, it's been sabotaged, right? Like, but even that, even on our own, when we're not infringing upon anything that, we're not taking away from the powers that be, we're just trying to do our own little thing on the side. And, you know, there's countless examples from, you know, Black Panther movement, Tulsa, Oklahoma, anytime when we have prominent leaders, somehow it gets sabotaged. And so it's frustrating because it's like, man, we can't do it with you. And then we try to do it on our own, and you're like, you guys are doing too well. So let's shut that down.
Even in more subtle ways, my colleague and friend Bianca Baldridge writes about after-school programs that may have begun with an effort to really address the social, emotional, cultural needs of Black children, and then they get subjected to kind of neoliberal reforms, and they say, no, your program needs to be more about helping them pass these tests. And so they find ways of resisting in the meantime. They say, okay, we'll try to do some of that test prep things because that's where the funding's coming from. You don't really care about these other ways we're trying to support Black young people. And so she writes a little bit about that, but then as I've talked more recently, as she's preparing the book, she says, well, actually what happens is they often is pushing the Black people out of the programs. And so it doesn't really have a happy ending, because what happens, either Black folks start mimicking the same desires, because they're like, we gotta get the money to keep our program going. What happens is slowly but surely the other aims of the program that really are just about supporting Black children, helping them love themselves, and all that, get pushed to the side in favor of focusing on what they're inadequate at this, you're inadequate at this, you're inadequate at this. And so you start mimicking that language and those logics of anti-Blackness that are implicit in the neoliberal project. That's all it is. But yeah, Bianca Baldridge's work kind of talks about how people do try to resist that, and that's just even after school programs, let alone a whole separate, community-based initiative.
This is my first year on admin team. I've been teaching for a really long time, and I've experienced the chicken. So this year we began looking at like our number of suspensions and who were suspended. And I believe I've gotten an ongoing beef with the other people that powers that be to discuss who suspended that, which ironically are mostly all people of color. And so when we're sitting down and we're having these talks, and I bring up over and over again, what do suspensions actually do? Whom do they actually help? What effects do they cause? And so, in essence, is this really a punishment? Why are we looking at these numbers in the beginning of the year and not trying to actively do something about it, especially when we're presented in situations in which we don't have to suspend someone? Why are we choosing to do that? And there was a moment this year where we had an instance in which I felt pretty strongly that we did not need to suspend this student. But I'm telling you, text message after text message from the person going, we need to send a message. We need to show this person that we're not going to tolerate that kind of behavior here. And I said, well, so we're going to tell them that because they did this thing, they don't have to come to school today. That'll show them. How dare they? They'll never do that again.
And they'll be behind.
And so there are members of our...
Well, and the other thing is that they're thinking that suspension serves its pedagogical function, right? That it somehow teaches, it's not only supposed to teach them. Remember, when you, often when somebody, tries to run away and you beat them in front of everybody else on the plantation, you do it to send a message to everyone, to scare them in some kind of way. And so not only is it not scary, in the sense of like not coming to school, not really registering as a punishment, but it is a punishment in the sense of you're further behind, which makes you feel more alienated from what's going on and more frustrated. And as a, I don't know if you've ever been frustrated, but I act out when I'm frustrated, if I'm hungry, or any number of things, right? If somebody I know somebody didn't like me or whatever, or I'm not understanding something in a class, being in a class that you don't understand what's going on. You start actually being resentful of the whole thing. So you actually, rather than it resulting in some kind of public, kind of pedagogical thing, because that's what they're really saying. It's like, we need to send a message, which is, in other words, we need to teach the other students that this kind of behavior will lead to being what, right? That's what you're saying.
And none of the students that we've suspended, I want to say, which, you know, we're better than most, so we're not suspending a whole bunch of black bodies, but of the students that we've suspended, each of the students that we've suspended has gone through a period of academic deficit and have at times exhibited similar behaviors. And so I then walk back into the office and go, exactly what did we do? Whom did we help? Who got the message? Because it's not this kid who's, if we suspended them, probably sitting at home right now comfortably, didn't have to wake up early, didn't have to get dressed, didn't have to make sure their homework was done.
Well, I think there are certainly students who, you know, might delight in the idea of not going to school. But it's not always a great experience at home when, because one, we think of like everybody not wanting to go to school, but so in other words, it's actually more of a reward. But actually, you know what, if your parents need to actually stay home with you, it can be actually pretty miserable staying home. It can be boring, because actually you may actually really like learning. You may actually like being in school. Actually, a lot of students, more of the students that if your school is actually worth going to. Here's the other thing, we have to think that like our school, what we're offering to children is actually worth their time. A lot of times what we're offering them is not really worth their time. We're wasting their time. We're offering boring curricula. We're not engaging them. So what makes us think that it's like, ooh, all the rage, like you should want to be here. So that's part of the humility we have to kind of take on. It's like, is this even worth it? But to the extent that it is, to the extent that young people actually go, I really would rather be in school. My misbehavior was not a reflection of me not wanting to be in school. It may have been a reflection of a disagreement I had with this child or something else, and this kind of confusion over this, or in my case, I talked too much because I was bored because the curriculum was boring. I finished this stuff where I felt insulted by it. Or the teacher was one of those teachers who looked at me like this, which is already a disdain and disgust. And so I'm like, I'm going to turn that back on. I already knew you don't like it. Schools are not safe places for black children. They're not safe places for Native children. The world is not a safe place. And so schools demand respect, right? I'm a teacher, therefore you should respect me. But there's nothing that schools have ever done that have deserve our respect. You've got to earn black people's respect because you spent so many generations killing us. And so you don't deserve black people's respect just by being a school. If anything, our memories of schooling, our parents' memories of schooling are places of trauma and death. And so the child comes in often with like, I don't know, one, I'm afraid, I don't know if this place is going to be safe. I'm seeing that teacher give me that smile. If your school doesn't have enough affluent people, then the culture universally does not respect children. When you have affluent people in your school, and I went to a school in Brooklyn, for example, because of K-8, where they were trying to be more diverse, and they had a lot of affluent whites, and then they had other populations, so it's diverse. But they needed the affluent white people in the school. You know, the security guards were like, so how are you today? You know, like bending down, everybody bent to the child's level, was talking to them, saying, oh, how's your weekend? Oh, you reading that book? Oh, blah, 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 blah. And kind of whole camaraderie was going on. They had little jokes that they told. There was affection, and a genuine affection. And so that was the culture. And so if you don't have that in your school, you don't deserve a bit of respect from any child. If it's a kind of disdain or get over it, you don't deserve anything. They should be acting up every day as a form of resistance. So that doesn't mean they don't love school. They would love a school where, you know, people ask them about their weekend, ask them what they're reading, ask them what they thought about a political issue or something going on in youth culture or something like that. But if nobody's asking them about that, if nobody's talking about Cardi B, in a way that actually respects Cardi B, and what she has to offer, what they are thinking, you don't deserve a bit of respect from any of those children. And so, in other words, because again, the school is already a hateful place, a place that has hated Black people. So you've got more work to do. You got to make it's our responsibility to make up for all that mess. They don't owe it. It's not. I'm a teacher, therefore I deserve respect. No, there's nothing in being a teacher or being in a school or an education that deserves any Black person's respect. Not until we offer that, until we make up for that. And so a lot of the misbehavior you see, a lot of the misbehavior I had, my suspensions, were a lot about that kind of sense of like, this place hates me, and I despise this place. And then the moments of joy that I had were like, oh, that teacher actually is really cool. That teacher actually wants, they see that I'm smart and they have, so in that class I'm doing really well. And I'm behaving totally differently. So it's not about school or it's not about learning. So in many ways, I was miserable when I was suspended. I mean, whatever. I did not want to be sitting at home for day on day, and it's just not what I wanted. And so it's not a reward necessarily. So you're sad at home. You're sad not being with your friends. You're sad not being in whatever fun parts there would be in school. It's not all miserable. So you're missing those good parts. And then you come back and you're behind. You also have a stigma because even the teacher that liked you is like, oh, I'm frustrated because now you're behind in this. So then even in the classes you like, you're even put behind. And that's a heaviness in the body. That hurts. That's painful. It's like a child is carrying that. And then it just becomes sad and like you want to cry just being in school because you're behind. The stigma is even more. You're seen as this bad kid, and then you get sent to the office. And then how do you act out? Think about how you act out as adults. When just something, I don't know, it's your road rage, or it's you're hungry to eat breakfast, or somebody said something negative to you the other day, or you found out you have a bill that you didn't realize you had. That's going to mean you can't do this other thing. And you just pout, you just find ways, you lash out at people. You do, I do. We find and we just aren't in our best spirits. And we have the capacities as adults to kind of like manage emotions and blah, blah, blah. We're like, okay, I know what's happening here, I'm taking this out. Children don't have 10, 15, 18 years old. You don't have that. You're just crying inside. And nobody cares. The whole school doesn't care. And they think that you're actually liking staying at home, that somehow you think you've won, and actually you're like, I'm not really winning by staying at home.
Well, let's continue to be mad together. Let's figure out ways to sort of lead these fugitive spaces, and let's most definitely give some love to Dr. Michael.
And I think one other thing, I think it's even in that last comment, it's what does it mean to deal with? I don't know. I think sometimes we've got administrative plans, we've got these things, but like, so much of this I'm realizing is, and I don't mean a touchy-feely care, kind of like, but there's got to be some kind of sense of like, I don't know, like part of anger, part of memory is always affection, right? It's a certain kind of commitment, it's kind of sense of I'm with you, and you're crying, and that's not, I don't want that for you. And actually just kind of being with, connecting with our students, seeing that. I mean, and often thinking about leadership positions, we're going to force these children to this, we're going to do this, but really they're breaking and hurting, and we're not breaking and hurting with them. So there's something about being broken that I think is in this part of dismantling, in the sense of like, allow ourselves to be broken with the communities, with the children, with their desires. Be with them.